Hello everybody, look who we're with today. We did promise actually in a previous video that we might be hinting that we might be doing more. My hat is doing the weirdest of things. It's going to be quite comical us with our red hats doing this. Where are we today? We are at Fan Bay Deep Shelter today, courtesy of National Trust, and obviously a familiar face who's going to be guiding us around. Hi mate, how you doing?
Hello, good to see you all.
So, in the capable hands, which is going to be really exciting, I'm obviously, of course, joined by wonderful Paul, and obviously even more wonderful, I've got to say that, because she's my lady, Sophie as well. Thank you so much to National Trust. We are just going to get straight on with it. So we're going to walk you down there and obviously be guided, which is really exciting. And the sad thing is, everybody, we've picked a beautiful day today, but we won't be experiencing it. We'll be quite down in the underground. But take care, and we will see you when we get back. See you in a minute, guys. Bye.
So welcome to Fan Bay Deep Shelter, and thank you very much for the introduction. My name's Richard Meadows, and I'm going to take you for a quick guided tour around this lovely wartime artefact here, and we'll have a look at some of the features of it. We'll also have a look too at the sound mirrors that we also uncovered during the excavation of the tunnels, and I really hope that you find this enjoyable. So Fan Bay gun emplacements were built on the direct orders of Winston Churchill, and during the latter stages of the summer of 1940 the site was surveyed and the decision was taken then where to build all of the gun emplacements around the coast here. At Fan Bay, construction started in October of 1940 with the digging out of the huge bases for the 6-inch guns. Down here in the deep shelter, construction starts on the 20th of November 1940. They start alongside each of the sound mirrors because it made just a convenient place to lower all the equipment down. They dig out the tunnels by hand, just using handheld compressed air tools, picks and shovels. They build a little railway as they go, and the waste chalk from the tunnels is taken out and is tipped over the cliff because that way, if any German spotter planes were around, they wouldn't see the chalk debris. But by the 28th of February 1941, we have a completely functional deep shelter, fully lined, fully constructed and ready for 203 Coast Battery of the Royal Artillery to come and populate. So during March of 1941, the guns are got ready for action. The troops now have moved into the deep shelter, and we can see very much what it looked like in those days by this wartime picture. It was painted by a wartime artist called Anthony Gross, and he painted this in May of 1941, sitting alongside one of the water butts that are over in the corner there. And we can see there the accommodation that the troops were in. It was simple, single width, double height bunks. And in fact, all of the tunnels that you see in Fan Bay Deep Shelter that are lined with this corrugated lining here, they are all accommodation tunnels for this pattern. We're at the end now of the first of the accommodation tunnels here at Fan Bay. We have a piece of the lining that's clearly way out of position. That was not done while the army were here. There were some very early urban explorers that came into the tunnels once the army had vacated the site, and they were looking for secret passageways. Rumour had it that there was a tunnel that connected South Foreland Lighthouse all the way to Dover Castle. Rumour is what it was because it never in fact existed, but why let the facts stand in the way of a good story? The structure for the tunnels is really quite interesting, and it helps us to explain a feature that we'll be coming to in just a few moments. As the tunnels were being drilled out, a team followed the drillers, erecting the steel work here, the steel frameworks and the steel lining that goes into the tunnels and prevents obviously the chalk from falling on people. The whole structure here is called colliery arching. These steel beams are really heavy. It takes 4 of us to lift one of these to make sure that they can put the arching up quickly. Then they take the tunnels out wider and taller than you see in here. The arches are then erected. The spreader bars are put in to keep all the arches at a constant pitch. And then the steel sheeting is slotted in on the angle, and that's why the tunnels are wider and taller than you see. Once the steel sheeting is in position, the miners then take some of the boulders that are being excavated and they pack them in behind the sheeting to make the whole structure solid. As we're walking around the deep shelter, you've probably noticed the walls are absolutely covered in condensation here. And that actually is part of the story of Fan Bay, because when the troops moved in here in March of 1941, it was relatively dry in here. It was absolutely fine. And although rather chilly, they would have been quite comfortable here. However, that was to change markedly as we got towards the summer of 1941. And as the weather warmed up, the warm, moist sea air came into the tunnels, and that coupled with the moisture in their breath led to a huge condensation problem that we still see today. The problem got so bad that the troops started to fall sick, and by late July of 1941, it was deemed impossible to live down here, and the troops were evacuated to tented accommodation behind the gun battery. We have a plan of the tunnels here, and this is the original 1940 plan depicted here on a print. And we can see the staircase that we came down to get into the tunnels here, and we can see that first tunnel that we walked along, and we turned, and we're now standing just about here opposite the doorway to these two compartments, which we'll walk through in just a few moments. We'll continue our tour then out towards the two sound mirrors here, and then we'll bring you back through to the staircase and we'll complete your journey there. We talked a bit about the construction of the tunnels, and we talked about all this fill material being placed around the steelwork to keep the tunnel integrity nice and tight and to support the walls of the tunnel. Now that was to come to play in this section here. And this is probably best described as a horrible mess. It is just as it was left, but this was not like it during the wartime. This was an accommodation tunnel up to the bend that you can see there. What happened here is after the war. So the war plays out. The deep shelter does get used through 1943 through to 1945. By the end of 1945, though, most of the gun batteries have been dismantled. But here at Fan Bay, the guns were kept active. They were used for artillery training all the way through to 1951. But at that stage then, the British government deemed that it's just too expensive to keep these gun batteries operational. And so they dismantle the guns, and then they call in a scrap dealer, a local scrap dealer then, to dismantle the steelwork up on the gun emplacements. He doesn't stop there, however, and he wants to have a go at the deep shelter, because after all, there's a mass of steelwork here that's really valuable. He starts to dismantle the colliery arching in this section, and then he pulls the whole structure over with chain winches like this one, not realising that all that chalk fill material is right above his head. The whole lot comes crashing down. There it is, still where he left it. He decides that the roof has caved in, that this isn't the place to be, and the deep shelter is left to dereliction. We found a number of interesting artefacts as we were surveying the tunnels just following the National Trust taking acquisition of the site in 2012. We found the remains of a paperback book up on some of the air trunking just in the section we've been in. The paperback book was called Shadow on the Quarterdeck, and it was still intact. There's still some of the pages readable. Obviously, after so many years, it wasn't in a very good condition, and that's in the Imperial War Museum under conservation. The other fascinating artefact that we found was this, and this is a Paul's coupon, and it dates from February the 20th, 1943. The football pools were kept going during the war as it was seen to be good for morale, and the troops obviously felt that they wanted to win their fortune down here in the deep shelter. The object of the exercise here was simply to guess which matches would end in a draw. And if you managed to get 8 of them right, and not too many other people did, you could win rather a lot of money. This coupon, the copy coupon here, was found tucked up in the roof members, almost out of sight, but not quite. And we managed to tease it out, and here it is. There's a certain irony to this, though, because it ties up beautifully with an unfortunate happening that we had on the site here, where we lost 2 people. The date here, as we can see, is February the 20th, 1943. And to be valid, the coupon would have to be back at the Pools Company before that date. With postal delays and so on, we would estimate the coupon probably being filled out about 10 days before. And ironically, on the night of February the 10th, 1943, 2 people lose their lives on this site as a result of incoming German shell fire. Edith Burville, a civilian cook, was stationed only about 200 or 300 metres away from here. And unfortunately, she was also manager of the NAFI, the Navy Army Air Force institution, the kind of shop. And unfortunately, the NAFI took a direct hit with Edith inside and she was killed instantly. On the same night, Harold Aram, one of the gunners here, he also lost his life due to shell splinters. So this is a very poignant reminder of the fact that there's a very real war going on and a lot of people are losing their lives. The 2 rooms we have here are the emergency provision store and also the little emergency hospital, more like a dressing station. We'll pop in there and see that one in just a moment. This is the emergency provision store. It was protected by steel doors either end, and we can still actually see the remains of the hinge pins on the floor there. The doors were taken away by the scrap man, of course. But in here, there will be enough provisions to keep up to the rated capacity of the shelter, 154 men, to keep them at least alive, if not happy, whilst they were pinned down in here due to incoming shell fire. We're now in the emergency hospital for the deep shelter, actually little more than a dressing station. In here there would likely been 4 beds, 1 in each corner, and almost certainly some sort of desk or table in the middle, and 1 or 2 nursing orderlies. But what's really fascinating about this room are the walls, because you may notice here that we've lost that nice clean line of the walls, and instead they look quite rusty, only it's not rust. When you touch the wall, it feels quite dry, which is really different from the other compartments that we've been in so far, where the walls are really wet and covered in condensation. What's happened here is they've experimented with really elementary attempts to get rid of the condensation. And here what they've done is they've sprayed the walls with glue, and then they've coated that glue with cork particles. And in doing so, the cork is giving an insulating effect, and that is attenuating the condensation. We've now emerged from the emergency hospital room now, and we're in the central tunnel. This is really an extension of the original drilled tunnel that came all the way through. And what we're going to do now is we're going to leave the accommodation tunnels for a little while now, and we're going to go into a fascinating section of chalk passageways that are ultimately going to lead us out to the sound mirrors. We're now in the chalk passageways that will ultimately lead us out to the sound mirrors, and it's in these passageways that we pick up some of the wartime graffiti. But look around us now and you can see you're inside the White Cliffs of Dover. There's some fascinating geological structures in here, the chalk itself, but also the flints projecting from the wall, and this fascinating flint shelf that goes on for hundreds of metres through the cliffs. But it's here where we pick up the wartime graffiti, and we'll just share some of that with you right now. The example we have here, the 172 denotes the 172nd Company of the Royal Engineers. They're the people who dug the tunnels in the first place. We have a date here, the 20th of January 1941. That's during construction. And we did have 3 names here, but they've been deliberately chipped out with a cold chisel. Over on the other wall here, just opposite the first piece of graffiti, is another piece here. And again, the same thing has happened. We've got a date here, 1940. This would be about Christmas 1940, because this would be about where they were at this time. And we've got a name here, and again, it's been deliberately chipped out with a cold chisel. Why, you may ask, has all the names been erased? To be frank, we don't know. We can surmise that either the commanding officer in charge of building the tunnels perhaps wasn't very happy with people carving their names in the tunnels. But equally well, we know that when they came to sort out the condensation problem, that was a different company of the Royal Engineers. That was the 238 Pioneer Corps. And we know that there probably wasn't a lot of love lost between the 238 Corps and the 172 Company. And we might surmise here that this chipping out may well have been done by 238. While we're in the chalk passageways here, it's worthwhile picking up some clues as to how the tunnels were actually constructed. And we see those in the walls of the tunnel. We can see where the point of the rock drill ended up. Just compressed air rock drills, handheld, several feet long, driving in and shearing the chalk away. We talked earlier about the fact that there was a railway line that actually took the chalk away and was dumped over the cliff. Here's a section of that railway line. But the most fascinating feature of all in this section of tunnel is just over here. And we have here a fossil, and this gives us a clue as to how old the chalk is at this point. This is the fossil of a clam, a snowshoe clam. This species didn't exist for very long geologically, only about 4 million years. And so this gives us the opportunity now to date this layer of chalk to approximately 84 million years old. Just be careful here as you come over the door threshold. There is a little bit of a trip hazard there. I don't want anybody going to flat. We're now at one of the 2 sound mirrors here at Fan Bay Deep Shelter. Now these sound mirrors predated the tunnels. These are World War I structures. This one in particular dates from 1917. During the early stages of the First World War, Britain was coming under aerial bombardment for the very first time. Not so much from fixed-wing aircraft, but from Zeppelins, hydrogen-filled airships. And they would come over and drop their bombs on Dover and Folkestone, and latterly quite a number of the towns up the east coast of England, causing quite a number of fatalities. The British government's answer to that at first was to station observers along the cliff tops, and their task was to spot these Zeppelins coming, raise the alarm, and hopefully somebody might be able to shoot them down. Such was the weapons in those days. But it wasn't very successful. They could only detect the Zeppelins coming somewhere between 5 and 10 miles away, which didn't give them very long to evacuate the people. One of the professors of the day, Professor Mather, was tasked with coming up with a better scheme. And his thoughts turned not to optical means, so not telescopes or binoculars. His thoughts turned to sound. The airships had an engine, and engines are loud. How could he amplify or focus that sound so that it could be heard from further afar? This was his answer. A sound mirror. Not parabolic, it's hemispherical. So it has a focal plane that exists in front of the mirror, and that plane could be explored with a detector. No electronics, pure acoustics. Such was the accuracy that they managed to get 25 miles range instead of the 5 to 10 miles that they were experiencing before. These mirrors were a huge success, and this one actually features in the 1917 War Diary and is credited with saving hundreds of lives in the area around here. We're now at the second sound mirror at Fan Bay. This one is very poorly documented. We know very little about this mirror other than it was probably constructed somewhere around about 1922. The big difference between this mirror and the first one that we looked at is that the first one is angled back at about 15 degrees, whereas this mirror is perpendicular. We surmise from this that they're not just looking for aircraft using this mirror, but they're also focusing on shipping. And more particularly, of course, in those days, was the advent of submarines and the ability of a submarine to recharge its battery whilst it's at periscope depth. So the mirror here, they're hoping to pick up the engine noise from the submarine. When the troops were in the tunnels, they would be served with food originally from Dover Castle, but that was to change during the early stages of the war. The food was then cooked in the cookhouse, and that's where Edith Burville, of course, came to play. But of course, if we've got troops eating and drinking and sleeping in the tunnels, then there's probably one rather important function that we ought to deal with. Where did they go to the toilet? And the answer is right here. Right here in front of the sound mirrors, because this is where they built the latrine blocks. No flush toilets, of course. There's very little running water out here. So I'm afraid this is the old bucket and chuck it technology. In here you can see 4 cubicles on the floor, still quite obvious there. Each cubicle would have a simple plank of wood inside it, and you did whatever you needed to in a bucket, which was then disposed of almost certainly over the cliff by probably the lower ranks of the organisation. So we've dealt with Scrapman's antics in the tunnels here, but just a couple of years later the troops are getting ready to leave this part of Dover for the last time. They decide that they're going to brick the tunnels up. They demolish the brickwork between the latrine cubicles, and they use those bricks then to brick the tunnels up. The local youths of Dover, of course, have other ideas. They've known all about these tunnels, and even though the site was being guarded for a period of time after the bricking up, these entrances actually weren't that well guarded. And as you can all probably well imagine, the tunnels become rather rapidly unbricked up. This section of wall collapses. Those bricks we found underneath where the Paul's Coupon now hangs. But the local youths of Dover are in, and they have a whale of a time in here during the 1960s. Rumour has it there were rave parties down here. Some say that homeless people slept down here. We don't really know what went on there, but it's quite plain from the graffiti that we find that there was quite a bit going on down here. We have to come in here every season and tap the walls with a hammer to just encourage it. It's going to delaminate. As we progress back into the deep shelter now, we reach this area of the chalk passageways, and we see quite a sudden change in the nature of the chalk. So we've lost that lovely pristine white chalk that we saw in the earlier tunnels, and we've now got this rather dull, dingy deposit all over. As we said, during the 1960s, the local users of Dover have a fine time in here, what with their rave parties and so on. But in 1969, they pushed their luck just a little bit too far. And in a section of tunnel that has to be supported by timber, they decide to light a fire. Before Dover Fire Brigade can deal with the situation, the timbers have burnt through, there's been a 20-ton roof fall, and this section of tunnel now gets cut off. And so the dark and dingy deposits that we see on the chalk here are actually no more than soot. That's the long list of the accommodation tunnels. The fire and the roof collapse here in 1969 was closely followed by fires in other underground structures near South Foreland. The result of this was that the emergency services and the local residents were getting really fed up with the vandalism and the goings on with these old wartime structures. They were seen in those days as having little value, and they served as a reminder to the people of Dover of the horrors of the war that they suffered. Coincidentally, in 1970, the British government came up with a scheme to rid beauty spots like the White Cliffs of Dover of the relics of war. It's called Operation Isau, and it does feature in Hansard. Kent County Council make an application under the provisions of Isau for the demolition of these wartime structures. They're successful, and in 1972 the bulldozers move in. They demolish the superstructures for the gun emplacements and for the deep shelter. They bulldoze over 1 metre of soil over the whole area, and the site is left to decay in secret. As we said, the tunnels were left to decay after they'd been covered up, and everybody really started to forget about them. But they didn't make a very good job of covering them up. The specification said they had to brick up all the entrances before they covered the site over, but they didn't. And by 1982, a small hole had opened up at the top of the staircase. And the presence of that hole rapidly became rather well known. People started again venturing into the tunnels. Quite a hazardous occupation, because the covering of the site led to the fact that the first flight of stairs, the first flight of 46 stairs, was completely covered with a mixture of soil and debris. So you ended up skating down on your back usually, particularly if you hadn't taken the precaution of grabbing the blue rope that somebody had thoughtfully tied to the top of the staircase. So throughout the years then, people were coming and going here, until in 2012 the National Trust acquired the land on which these tunnels stand. Following the acquisition, we sealed off the top entrance. The hole was now no more. And we ventured into the tunnels to do graffiti and artifact surveys, and really to see if there was a possibility that this could be opened to the public. Our visitor experience manager, John Barker, proposed a project to the National Trust trustees to open this site to the public. And remarkably for the National Trust, this was accepted. It was the first of its kind. We weren't sure at all whether they would accept it, but they did. And in late 2013, we start surveying the site. In 2014 and 2015, then we undo all the work that Isau did. We unearth the sound mirrors. We take away all the spoil in the staircase. We rebuild the entrances by the sound mirrors. And by the 20th of July 2015, we're ready to open to the public for the very first time. One really fascinating piece of graffiti that we did find here was here. And this is a Mr. W.J.H. Gardner. The lovely thing about this is that he's actually carved his army number into the wall, and army numbers are totally unique. And so we did some research on him. Unfortunately, he died some years before, but his family was still alive, and we were able to invite them down to Fan Bay Deep Shelter to have a good look round with us and to see the writing that Mr. Gardner had left on the wall. We're now in the officers' quarters at Fan Bay Deep Shelter. So again, very much like all the other accommodation here, accommodation in bunks, and generally here there would probably be 3 or 4 officers accommodated here. Not a great deal to see. The walls are fairly bare. It's not usually part of our guided tour for that reason. But yes, this is where the officers would have been, probably curtained off at each end. That will give them just their little bit of seniority. What we're looking at here is a calibration round. Some people will call it a shell, but in reality it's a shot. It's completely solid, it's iron. It weighs about 42 kilograms or about 90 pounds. And this round would primarily be used to calibrate the weapon prior to firing. So this would be loaded into the breech of the gun with the propellant behind it. The gun would be fired at a known bearing and elevation, and then the radar operators would be looking for the shot falling into the sea and the column of water going up. And that, so you knew which direction you were aiming the gun in, you knew where your shot had actually fallen, so now you can calibrate your gun. Well, that concludes our little tour of the deep shelter here at Fan Bay. We're going to head on up the stairs now, and hopefully in just a little while we'll take a look at the gun pit that we excavated a couple of years ago. So we'll see you in a few minutes. Yep.
At least they're actually consistent sizes.
They are actually, yeah.
Nothing worse when there's a step that's slightly off.
Oh, my daughter's house over in Luxembourg's got one of those. Every bloody time I fall upstairs. It's about an inch, it's quite considerable, it's about an inch difference. Yeah, right at the end of the front. These are the miniature colliery arches. So the other ones are 9-foot ones, these are 4. We're now in the plant room at Fan Bay Deep Shelter. This room wasn't in the original plans for the shelter at all. We've talked about the condensation problem in the tunnels that they had when they first took occupancy here. And this room really was constructed to enable them to feed warm, pressurized air down through a duct, down the stairway and into the tunnels. And there was a series of airlocks in the tunnels, brick structures within the tunnels that directed that air around the tunnels and then back up the staircase. And I'll leave to your tender imagination to work out the fact that that air probably didn't smell very good with 100 or so unwashed bodies down there, and the food probably wasn't that good either, and they probably all smoked as well. But this was the plant room. This was constructed in early 1942, and it was to house the air handling equipment for the ventilation system. So we're at fan bay gun emplacement number 3. The fan bay guns were 6-inch guns, so that's a 6-inch diameter barrel. The internal diameter, that is, about 15 centimetres. And they would fire a shell weighing around about 50 kilograms or about 100 pounds. They would fire that shell about 14 miles out into the Strait of Dover. The gun emplacement here, the gun would have sat within the gun ring, the hole in the middle of this of the concrete here. Within that gun ring, there were a number of holding down bolts for the gun mount. The gun would then have sat on top of it. Around the gun itself, there's this blast apron, and that is to prevent the shock wave from the gun firing from picking up pebbles and stones and so on and throwing them in all directions and injuring people. You can see the aiming marks painted onto the sidewall there of the gun ring. That is the direction in which the gun is firing, and they would simply match the aiming mark on the back of the gun to the required number there. That would give them an approximate bearing, and then they could find that up using their instrumentation. Careful as you go down, there's a lot of rubble. Okay. I'm now standing in the centre of the gun ring, exactly where the gun mount would have been. There would have been a huge iron mounting here, bearing in mind that these guns were initially intended for naval use. They had to be converted for land use, and that conversion was done with the mount. So we can see the huge number of holding down bolts here, necessary of course because of the recoil of the gun and the sheer weight of it, somewhere around about 30 tons. The gun then would have sat here and then been aimed obviously in this direction. There would have been quite a lot of electrical facilities associated with the guns. The aiming instructions would come from the various plotting rooms that are around here. So we have the fortress plotting room over by the lighthouse. We also have the local plotting room here. They're calculating the precise bearings and elevations for the gun. It's done using an analog computing table, and those results then are fed down to the gunners literally here by a series of indicator dials coupled together with what we call mag slip. It's just electrically linked pointers. The shells for the guns were held in magazines that were at the end of long tunnels here. The tunnels were angled so that any blast that occurred within the gun emplacement area wouldn't carry down the tunnel and set the charges off. The shells were brought out of the magazine, down the tunnel, and into these cupboards called ready-use lockers. There'd be a mixture of shells in some lockers, and in other lockers the propellant, cordite, would be stored. And in the main, the shells would simply be handed up from the locker and actually stood on the concrete apron there. And we actually have an archive photograph actually showing some shells just here, ready for loading into the weapon. Behind the ready-use lockers were several rooms. Here we have the infilled men's shelter. So this, when the gunners weren't actually actively firing the guns, they would be resting or doing light work in this room here. On the other side of the magazine door, we had the officer's shelter and also the gun store, where spare parts for the guns, lubricants and so on, would have been stored. And then in front of those two rooms was another set of ready-use lockers. Unfortunately, we've not been able to excavate these rooms. They were so badly damaged during the covering up of the site in 1972 that the brickwork is largely detached from the foundations and is in risk of collapse. So we have left the rooms deliberately unexcavated so that they can still exist.
Hello everybody. As per usual, I have been quite quiet in this, which is probably a blessing in disguise for most of you watching, but I've been very busy filming, and thank you so much, Richard, for I can't tell you how pleasure it's been to have the opportunity to be shown around with your infinite knowledge. That is nice because we're all history buffs here, but it's nice to always be humbled and to learn new things that we've never known about today. And I certainly today have learned a lot of new things that I can now take to many other World War II sites that we'll be exploring in the future. Also, I want to say a massive thanks to John National Trust. What a truly nice person for allowing us access and for arranging Richard to take us around as well. And obviously for these two wonderful people here, Sophie and Paul, who have been providing you the photos during over the lane for the conversation, some of the wonderful clip art as well. In the link below, I will put out the Instagram for Sophie. I will put out an Instagram link for Paul as well. And obviously, please check out the National Trust and the wonderful project and the work that they are doing in conservation and restoration for this wonderful, wonderful site. Is there anything you want to end on, Richard?
I'd just like to thank you all for coming here and allowing us to share the experience with you all. It's been quite a journey. This has been a 3-year project. We're about 2.5 years through the project now. The good news is that the project will continue after its end date. We have made other arrangements, and so the site has got some longevity, and we very much look forward to welcoming you onto the site here at Fan Bay whenever you can make it. Have a look at our opening times. They're on the National Trust White Cliffs website, and we'll look forward very much to meeting you.
Thank you so much, mate. Honestly, I just wanted a pleasure because we hope that we will be working with them again at some future point down the road. But for now, me and Sophie especially have got our own adventures, which Paul will be joining us occasionally on as well. But for now, what an incredible opportunity. The memories of this place will live long in the memory, literally, for all of us in time. And as what Richard rightly said, please come down here, check this place out for yourselves, engage with it, preservation and conservation and everything else in between. And on a beautiful day like this, to observe the beautiful views across the channel. In the immortal words of Phoenix history, thank you so much for coming along with us. We will see y'all very soon, independently of whenever these get taken about. Obviously, we hope to see Richard at a later date, hopefully, as well. It'll be fantastic. And again, thank you, mate. Right, take care, everybody. See you later, and feel free to check out all the links below. National Trust, Sophie and Paul's one intermittently. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye.